Okay, the report card grades are out. Not necessarily the grades that those of us who are used to all A's in school certainly would expect. And so maybe from a starting perspective, we do a little bit of what may amount to a little bit of a parent-teacher conference here, right, to sort of discuss some of these. Action-packed day, of course, talking about some of the specific indicators going forward. And I couldn't be more pleased to have an amazing group of folks to kind of start the discussion on the specific grades, the indicators, and what some of it actually mean. Many of you all know sort of the esteemed panelists here. We've got the Honorable Doug Bush, who of course runs acquisition, logistics, and technology for the U.S. Army after a distinguished career on the legislative side, House Armed Services Committee and elsewhere. Former Congressman Mac Thornberry, who of course chaired the House Armed Services Committee for a number of years and is thinking about sort of driving many of these issues, and a member of the advisory board for this initiative. Raj Shah, who has worn many hats over the years, but of course is a technologist, a startup founder, investor, and used to run a little thing called Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, and is thinking, I think, a lot about Silicon Valley Bank and what that means these days, so we might ask him some of that. And then Sri Ramaswamy, who's actually a former colleague of mine, so great to see off doing amazing things, who's an architect of many of the growth and competitiveness initiatives of the Department of Commerce, right? And so as we think about this holistically from, what national security means in terms of sort of a broader set of outcomes, Sri brings sort of a great lens on that. So maybe we start a little bit with how should we think about a report card like this, what it means, and sort of how it how it can be sort of driven in a conversation. So maybe Mac, just to start with you, Congressman Thornberry, if you think about, like we said, sort of the grades are out there. You've got sort of these 10 indicators. I mean, question one is almost, why is this particularly important to think about now? And as you think about sort of as a policymaker, guide us a little bit on like how you would think about, using grades like this and what it would mean from your perspective.
Well, why is it important now? I think everybody agrees that innovation and technology is going to be the key driver between us and China, between democracy and authoritarian, and it's not just military, it's economic, it's societal. This innovation base is really going to help be a primary driver, I'd say, of our future. How does it help policymakers? I think it's incredibly valuable. First, just because of the categories it lists. I think it wasn't until I became chairman that I started to focus on outside investment and talk to investors. Well, we don't vote on that in the Defense Authorization Bill or appropriation, and yes, it's a key component of our national security innovation base, talent pipeline. So you can, just having those categories there, I think is a great tool. And secondly, what I'm really fond of is this differentiation between inputs and outputs. Because from my perspective, you see lots of churn, lots of new offices, lots of new spending, lots of new initiatives. But I don't think, in Congress at least, we were very good at monitoring, particularly measuring what came of all that stuff. And so just having that difference in, okay, these are the inputs, but this is what it means to the warfighter, that's what really counts. Last thing I'll just mention is I really like the cross-cutting initiatives that are part of this report, because there's a number of studies, a number of very helpful insights that are going on all around the country. I don't think there's a lot of disagreement about what our problems are, what we need to do better, but still we're not making the progress that we should. And this, one of those cross-cutting initiatives, it's the incentives, it's the culture. And as Senator Talent pointed out, and I hope Doug doesn't get offended, it's not just the Pentagon, it's Congress too, that's part of this culture, part of the incentives and so forth, that we need to do better. So you just take all that together, and you may quibble with a grade here or there, I think all of us might, but as a tool, I think it's really helpful.
Great, that makes a ton of sense. Maybe Sri, just to start with you a little bit, because we'll cover a couple different grades, and we'll cover a couple of these different cross-cutting themes. Maybe start with the thing that's highest on the list, right? Which is innovation leadership overall. So this idea that it's an A minus or or thereabouts. As you think about architecting sort of a broader set of sort of policies, because we'll talk defense modernization, all that, but just kind of the role of sort of innovation in terms of driving sort of national security innovation, driving a broader set of sort of economic outcomes in the U.S. from a productivity perspective and overall. How should we kind of think about why this is important for that overall, kind of multiplier effect from an economic perspective?
I think, well, first of all, thank you guys for putting this thing out. I think it is helpful to build on the Congressman's point, partly because it helps some of us who are in the belly of the beast. Right? It sort of convinces us that we're not crazy. We're fighting some of the battles that we're fighting. So for instance, on customer clarity, we've spent 2 years developing our strategy for the CHIPS Act, and sitting at Commerce, this is a supply side program. We've got loans, we've got grants, there's an investment tax credit. We don't have a demand signal, right? We cannot issue a demand signal, and so we need other agencies, including the Defense Department primarily, to issue that demand signal. And it's been a conversation, let's say, right? It's been an interesting conversation trying to figure out how you articulate the demand signal. I think on your question about the innovation leadership, look, I think there's a difference, between scientific innovation, which is what it sounds like this is focusing on, versus engineering innovation. And I would encourage folks to keep that in mind, because we're seeing that in real world. When you think about things like hard tech, deep tech, right? And we're seeing this now. We saw it in semiconductors. We're seeing it in the bioeconomy. We're seeing it with quantum. We're seeing it with even things like energy, right? When stuff leaves the lab and starts to get commercialized, you run into this wall where we seem to have lost the ability to engineer things, right? Engineering means you need a lot of capital in the real world. You need a lot of patience, right? This is all trial by error, learning by doing constantly, right? Take a new semiconductor fab. It takes 5 years for that thing to get going to peak utilization and actually become commercially viable. Nobody's supporting that stuff in the meantime. And so you talk about quibbling with certain grades, like that's the one that I would potentially quibble with, is I don't know that I would give our innovation leadership an A minus. I would give our scientific leadership definitely an A minus, maybe even an A plus. But I think our engineering capacity seems to be diminishing. And so one of the things so from a productivity standpoint and economic growth standpoint, that's what starts to matter, right? And it's all about, how do I reverse engineer a decommissioned coal site to build a small modular reactor there? Like, that's innovation. I need to figure out how to do this, right? How do I take, an EV battery plant and make sure that it comes to full yield as fast as I can before the Chinese get there, right? Like, those are the kinds of things that we're struggling with. And I think that's where what we're looking at from a commerce standpoint is, how do you get other sources of capital? How do you think about incentive structures that allow companies to make those long-term investments, knowing that the capital utilization will be low, knowing that there'll be risks along the way, and all this while you've got the Chinese sitting out there over-investing in capacity, driving down the margins, driving down the returns, creating those headwinds. Like, how do you fend that off, right?
Yep.
I think that's the central problem that, from a commerce standpoint, we're trying to figure out how to solve.
Doug, you obviously are very well known for driving a bunch of very innovative acquisition processes and kind of trying to pull in quite a bit from sort of a commercial technology perspective and otherwise. How do you react to that, and particularly from thinking about this sort of core bringing and driving the innovation leadership, the engineering leadership and others into what you need to do from a defense modernization perspective?
Sure. So the first thing I liked about the report is I agree with its fundamental premise that the private sector's ability to innovate is intimately tied with America's national security success. It was critical to us winning the Cold War. We out-innovated the other side. We got to do it this time. So I think I like that it comes at it from that perspective, and I completely agree with that. And government has a role. Government can do a lot to shape where funding flows and pick winners and advance things, but the fundamental thing we still need is private sector innovation. And I'm seeing a lot of it. So I guess I have good and bad news. So the good news is when you get down into inside individual programs, we often see, in a lot of cases, good engineering, good work being done. It's often bigger companies leveraging smaller companies. That doesn't always get noticed as much, but it's there. So in most cases, we find a way to work with our private sector to innovate. Where we struggle, I think, is that there's a bit of a crowd out effect with funding for the big programs and the big initiatives, make it very hard to create room and funding space and among, it's like I could just tell you, having done 2 budgets now inside the Pentagon, it's a Shark Tank. It's, everyone's competing for the same dollars and all of the requirements are valid. So how do we, from a budgeting standpoint and managing the Pentagon, where we're putting money and moving money, one thing I took from the report was we have to do better in not letting that happen. We've got to deliberately create an innovation space and funding that every year we know, okay, this percent's got to go to that.
Yeah.
And it means stopping other things. So a friend of mine, a colleague I brought into the work with me, my principal deputy, Young Bang, he came from the private sector. And his description of how it's a fairly ruthless process for triaging what's working and what's not in kind of lab type efforts, because you have to create funding for the new stuff. You can't just keep trying to innovate on the schedule indefinitely, which government R&D at times can fall into that practice.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One of the things that the report card highlights is the fact that, different lists of sort of critical technology areas take sort of plus or minus 14. A significant minority of those actually have a pathway sort of to a program of record, right? And so this piece around making trade-offs, ultimately it's, it ends up being sort of the MDAPs that get favored over some of the earlier stage stuff that gets pulled through. How do you think about that from sort of the trade-off perspective in which you're trying to drive?
Well, first of all, not everything should transition. Not everything works. Like I said, Shark Tank, and that's okay. That's competition among the innovators, and that's good. And not everybody gets a lollipop. However, it's incumbent on we in the services certainly, as we try to work this, you have to deliberately make the space. Now, one backstop has been Congress. Actually, Congress often does some of the hard work on pushing innovation and innovative solutions on the department. When we can't find a way to do it ourselves, and I think that's good. You need both branches working together, but the departments, we can do a better job on that on our own. And like was said, there's great efforts underway up at OSD, multiple new offices, previous administration and this one. I think there's a lot of energy. It's all pointing in the right direction, but we have to actually do it now and actually move the dial, which the report fairly says you really haven't seen a significant change yet.
Raj, we've talked a couple of times already about sort of incentives and this idea that there is a misalignment between like returns, for example, on sort of expectations from like a venture capital or startup side versus, again, the sort of pipeline as you think down sort of contracts over time. As you counsel startups, you obviously run a VC firm now. How do you think through that with the folks who are thinking about sort of scaling and have obviously a lot of passion around getting technologies in the hand of the warfighter, given value of death and all that kind of stuff, right?
No, thanks, Dale, and tied to the report, it's glad to see that there's now metrics that we can measure, and unlike a lot of higher institutions, there's not a lot of grade inflation here. So if we think about, in my view, incentives, right, and we think about what both Doug and the chairman said of how important the private sector is, economic security is national security. And the Pentagon and the DoD and the government are no longer the monopoly buyer, right? They're not the biggest fish. So how does both the first and second branches of our government incentivize the private sector and private capital to do what we want in terms of supporting national security? And so, my general view is that we're not going to buy ourselves out of this problem, given the fiscal constraints that we're going to have over the next decade. And so it's really going to be about efficiency and optimization of the budgets that we do have. So in the report, it talks about R&D spend by our traditional industrial base, which is very, very important. It's 3% currently R&D towards technology versus about 15% or more in the private sector. Again, what are the incentives that the government could do to increase that? What are incentives to have our talent base stay here, right? In the report, it talks about 60% of STEM grad students are from India and China. The vast majority of them struggle to find ways to stay here. what can we do to incent them and allow them? And same with the private capital. How do we? What are ways that the government could say we want to promote our winners and have them really focus in on government national security problems to survive? And again, the report shows the average SIBR contract is about $1 million of capital, and the average follow-on after that is $600K. Right, so we can measure that. Perhaps that's not enough, and we can focus efforts to improve that.
What do you? One of the suggested recommendations is this idea of making bigger bets, right, in specific areas. I think space, autonomy, and some other areas are highlighted. How do you think about that in terms of what a big bet actually looks like from a demand signal perspective? Like, what are the specific pieces you would be kind of looking for to drive that much more toward this idea of clearly there are sort of winners as Doug talked about?
I would say my recommendation to the Pentagon and other government agencies is twofold. One, be more demanding, and I'll explain what that means. And two, have a level playing field. So by the first one, be very clear about what it is you want, and have a set of rules that will select the best answer, right? The best technology, and be demanding, right? There's no free pass. But it should be, the competition should be based on which technology or innovation delivers, not on who's got the best bid and proposal team and government lobbyists, right? And so if you change that, I think you'll get the outcomes that you want.
Yeah. One of the other indicators that scored quite a bit on the lower side is obviously talent, right? And of course, structurally, there's a skills gap in the U.S. in terms of like key skilled labor areas. If you think about the driving need for sort of software talent, for example, in a lot of sort of the digitally oriented programs that Doug, you and others are driving quite a bit. This is a key area. I mean, maybe Doug, just for you as a starting point, as you think about filling sort of the key technical talent areas, some of the things that you all are trying to do, really just sort of get folks in the door, sort of drive this overall sort of STEM and otherwise talent base. In the absence of solving a bunch of broader demographic questions and things like that, what are the things that you all are doing in kind of the near term to try to address this?
Sure. So one particular area of focus has been software talent. Mm-hmm. So just broadly speaking, since I arrived, major goals just over my time there, update the Army to roughly 2022 practices for acquiring software. And what we quickly run into there is not just changing policies. You have to have the people who know how to do it on the government side. So that's both hiring in talent. So we've been able to, for example, bring in some recent senior leadership from the private sector. So not your traditional government hires. And it makes a huge difference. They just bring a different frame of mind than how a government person thinks after doing it the government way for 20 years in software. The second thing is using new authorities from Congress, and this has been absolutely critical. The middle tier acquisition pathway gets a lot of discussion. Actually, the software pathway is in some ways more radical when you think about how the department acquires things. And when I got there, we had 6. I think we're up to 12, and it's rising now, programs using this new pathway. If you show you can do it in a modern way, you attract talent that wants to be in on the latest thing. I mean, the value of service is there for government folks. The mission matters. In my case, you're trying to equip the best soldiers in the world with the very best stuff. I mean, that's a great mission. But if we ourselves modernize, I think we'll attract the talent. Subpoint to that is, though, our systems for bringing in talent, you still have to incentivize people to stay. I think one great thing that Congress did was the cyber accepted service. Certainly helps us on the cyber side retain talent. I've mused about something like that for software skills in terms of software development, because I see that we clearly need it, and for us to afford to retain that talent, it is a competition and you have to pay enough. So, software right now is, I think, the Army's #1 focus on kind of upskilling our workforce.
Yeah. Maybe Shri, same question for you as you're thinking about sort of the workforce development pieces and all that Commerce is trying to drive. I know this is something that's very top of mind for you. So how are you thinking about working through this?
I mean, I can certainly speak to the private sector engagement of this particular question. I think, maybe leaving the software piece aside, in the other groups of workforce, I think the commercial sector has the same problem in many ways as the defense sector. So if you think about, and there are these two different groups of talent that we worry about, right? One is the engineers, right, the material scientists and the engineers, the process engineers, all of those sorts of folks, the PhDs, in those sorts of places. And the other one is just, we talk about this all the time, right? Welding, pipe fitting, the trade skills, which we've been talking about this, at least I've been talking about it for 15 years, right? And people have talked about it for much longer than that, and yet we haven't been able to crack that nut. And even the companies we're seeing are struggling with it. And I think one of the things that we are trying to do here at Commerce is to try to do a better benchmarking within the private sector. And so when we talk to these companies, for instance, who are thinking about the CHIPS Act, many of these companies are very large. They have multiple locations in the US. They work with a variety of universities and community colleges and trade schools, but they don't necessarily benchmark internally themselves. And we ask them, what type of program, among all the programs that you work with, which one gives you the most productive workers 6 months into the job? And they won't be able to tell you that. Right? And so that's part of the benchmarking is, okay, you got to figure out, which programs are the most efficient at giving you the best workers. And then you also have to figure out which programs are the most efficient at taking a large and diverse intake and making sure they're coming out, well deployed. And so that's part of what we're trying to figure out is how do you make sure that the private sector is, has the incentives to do that kind of benchmarking, to create that sort of a marketplace where you actually have people know what works and are able to quantifiably assess what works and be able to scale that up.
Mac, one of the, I think, the things that came up repeatedly in the discussions in developing the report card was capacity for and comfort for taking risk associated with core tenet from an innovation perspective. So there's this idea that we need to go faster, we need to be bolder from a true step change level, right? This is, there's obviously some things from an incremental perspective you should do, but some of the things we're talking about are structural things that are going to require a fundamentally different way of thinking about this, right? And part of this is, in some areas, 100% mission success makes sense. In some areas, going faster and being bolder actually means comfort with sort of capacity to fail, right? And as you think about sort of that drive towards speed and sort of the trade-off from a risk perspective, what are the things that you would potentially like to see change culturally or otherwise in terms of the conversation around Washington on some of this? Because there's a little bit of a disconnect, right, between how Silicon Valley talks about this, for example, and how you see this on the DC side. What's your take?
No, there's no question. There is a cultural challenge at being able to take a risk. I kept threatening when I was chairman, and my crack staff would never let me do it, to hold a hearing just with program managers whose programs had shown what does not work. And instead, what happens is we will have a hearing and rake somebody over the coals for their program failing, continuing to pour money into it and wasting money. But if you try things and learn what does not work and do it fast, that's great. That's increasing your knowledge of learning. And yet, I'll just say Capitol Hill is one of the deterrents to that, because you're afraid of getting called up or being called out in the press or something. So it's that whole mindset of trying things, learning what does and does not work, and moving on. I do think, and I'll venture off into dangerous territory here, we need to do our funding a little differently so that there is a pool of money for a particular purpose. For example, the National Security Commission on AI recommended a pool of money for AI applications, and you can move fast. You can try a number of things. You see, that's not working, this will work, and you move your money over here without going and asking Mother May I 2 years in advance before you make those adjustments. So there's got to be parameters around it, but I'd like to give Doug some pots of money for a purpose and then let him make the adjustments as the technology is developed.
That would be amazing, sir.
Theo, can I add
Yeah,
something
please.
with the chairman had? I 100% agree. And I almost want to change the conversation of what is risk, right? So I want to challenge the presumption that doing things in the way a startup would, or this fast iteration, creates more risk. I would actually argue it creates less risk, particularly in software. If you look at the DoD's history in building large software programs, the vast majority do not deliver the capability and are all over budget. But we think that's the lower risky pathway rather than an iterative approach where the things that work you double down on. And I would submit that the current system, all it's doing is transferring the risk, and it transfers the risk from cubicles from the Pentagon to our warfighters in the field. And that's not the risk trade-off we should take.
Yeah. We're going to open up to questions in a minute, so start thinking about what you want to grill our panelists on. But maybe just one question for the group, and we'll go a little bit down the line if that's okay. There's 10 different indicators. Obviously, there's a range of grades, as we talked about, everything from that A in innovation leadership to the D on customer clarity and on talent base. As you look at that, what is the one indicator that you are sort of the most focused on that you would hope that we raise the grade or really sort of double down on, so that when this report card is run in say 2 years, you think you can, there's sort of a material sort of change from an outcome perspective? I don't know, maybe Doug, start with you.
Sure. So there's one, and we're actually working inside the Army on having better measurements of this, and that's technology transitions from, this is value depth. This is starting with a company that's innovative and actually having it pulled through all the way to procurement contracts. First thing we have to do there is see ourselves, and we're working on that. We brought in, my new deputy assistant who's working on technology transition, Mr. Willie Nelson. He is an innovator. He's an engineer. It's not no offense to scientists, but not quite your traditional scientist. He's I have him focused on that. That's his number one job, and I think he's off to a great start. And so our ability to get things over the line, and really there's two ways we're looking at it. One is the traditional method, which is something comes out of a government lab, but you've actually budgeted for it and you have a handoff to a program manager. It moves into a system. So we get no credit for it. We do a lot of that in the classified space, so that's okay. I'll take no credit there. But it needs to be the normal thing. It should not just exist in this special classified world. The second thing, and this gets to what the chairman was referring to, is the ability to take advantage of unexpected things. So you can plan, okay, the lab is working on something 3 years from now, hopefully to be at the right tech level. But then you also get your things from the private sector that come in unexpected, that you can't plan 3 years in advance, and that's good. And we do have to have a way to try to catch those things and not let them fall. It does get back to some of what the chairman was saying about having more flexible accounts. That's a running conversation with the Hill. I'm going to have it again. Ultimately, the authorizing and appropriations committees have to be okay with that, and their members do. But they've done it before in certain areas. So I think the aperture is there. We just have to show we've got ways to track it and provide them with information on what we're doing. And I think the precedents are there. We just need to take a run at select areas. AI could be a great one. And then show some success, and then maybe that would open the door to it being a model, not just a one-off that happens every now and then.
Can I just emphasize, when in the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan, when we were losing limbs and all that stuff, we created the Joint IED Task Force, and they had a pool of money, and they could move fast to solve this problem. We had a sense of urgency then. We need a sense of urgency now to deal with these issues. I would say the most important metric, or the one I would highlight, as I've already betrayed, it's an output and it's defense modernization. Because we can talk about all this stuff, do all this stuff, but if it doesn't translate into capability for the warfighter, then it doesn't really matter very much. And I would even go so far as to say morally, our country has a responsibility to provide the warfighters with the best tools, the best technology that our whole country, not just the government, but our whole country can provide. And so it's that metric of that output. What's the result of all this churn and money and stuff? To me, that's the most important.
And on that one, as a reminder to folks, defense modernization intentionally was defined fairly holistically, right? So on the capability side, you're talking platforms, you're talking interoperability, right? You're talking sort of capabilities of the folks who are operating them from a sort of skilling perspective. And then it was the ability and capacity to operate within and innovate on sort of new pathways for acquisition, right? So the two pieces are in there. Raj?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of important ones, so it's hard to choose one. But if I had to, so in my day job as a venture capitalist, early stage, the number one thing we look for is teams. Who are the people behind the innovation and talent? So to me, talent's the largest one. How do we encourage the great engineers and scientists we have in this country to think about national security, come spend time in government, build companies focused on that, and then how do we continue to cull the best talent from around the world to solve these problems? So that'd be the top one.
Just to follow up on that, because there's a perception often that, the best technologists and engineers and others in the United States don't necessarily want to work on national security challenges, right? They would sort of prefer to do, other things like, cat filters on, various things and things like that. Is that your experience?
My experience is exactly opposite. I think young, talented people in our country, they want meaning. They want to work on things that are important. And there's no more important project than protecting democracy and peace. So they want to work on it. They need to find a way to work on it that makes sense economically as well. But there's a ready and willing force.
Yeah.
I would certainly agree with that. I think there's a sense of mission. I think it's up to us to figure out how to tap it. I think as far as indicators go, look, I'm glad you guys put customer clarity at number one. I've been in this role for 2 years, my first time in government. I came to commerce because it was pitched as this place where, we're going to envision a more muscular commerce department that works with the Defense Department, national security meeting economic security. And one of the things I've seen, to my surprise a little bit, is how much people underestimate the role of the Defense Department in issuing the demand signal. It is true, right? The Defense Department does not do high volume purchases, but when you talk about emerging technologies that are approaching the real world, you don't need high volume purchases to drive the risk down at that stage. You need a low volume purchase that is willing to pay a higher price point and that is willing to work with the supplier to go through that iteration and the testing and make sure that it's meeting mission requirements, right? That is a huge role that the Defense Department can play. That's what the DoD played back when the microelectronics industry was nascent, right? We don't need, like I said, we don't need the high volume, but somehow if we can solve that customer clarity problem, you will be solving not just for Pentagon acquisition, but you'll be solving for a wider economic security problem as well.
That's great. All right, we'd love to get the audience in on the conversation at this point. There are microphones, I think, on other sides, so please wait to be called on. But yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Brian McGrath, and I'd like to talk about that gaudy A- for a second. Was political innovation leadership and policy innovation leadership and bureaucratic innovation leadership taken out of that and put into the other grades to achieve that gaudy A-? Because I understand that engineers and the scientists may be up in the A-, A+, but those other areas probably wouldn't earn that grade.
So, I mean, from the perspective of sort of what's in what indicator, certainly. I mean, it's ultimately sort of, technological leadership that's driving a lot of that. But this, I guess, kind of broadly gets back to this point on customer clarity, the piece around sort of policy coordination. We haven't really talked about government alignment, and one of the pieces in there that is sort of a cross-cutting theme that, NSIB actors sort of lack sufficient coordination toward common goals is sort of a finding across the board. So I don't know if anybody would like to kind of react to that, as whether that sort of resonates or not.
Well, just offer, the Army's a big place.
Yeah.
Okay, and I would love it to be all perfectly coordinated and doing exactly the same thing and marching exactly the right direction all the time. Pretty hard. And also, it's not that, we don't do our best to do that, but I think, approaching, the Army, if we were a company, we would be one of the biggest companies in the world all by ourselves. So I think a little patience with some dissonance at times is helpful. I think it's incumbent, though, on us to make it easier to figure out if you're talking to actually the right person. So I've met with companies who've said, well, we're working with the Army, and I always have to ask who exactly, almost like a name. And sometimes they will be working with someone who's part of the system, but not the key part. and not that, and that's our fault for not communicating better how to get into the Army, in my case, and where the discretion really lies and where the key elements are. So I think it's fair that, you know, if they were applying that grading scale to the government side, it probably wouldn't be an A minus. But, you know, it's an area we're very aware of, working better. You know, modern communications and internet make it much easier to do this. We should be able to do this better. It's a small thing, but for example, we're trying to centralize all of our cyber activity inputs through, you know, a single website, just for starters, just so people have one place to go. That's a small thing, but it's the kind of thing we need to do across the board.
I can maybe add a little bit to that too. Look, it's hard to coordinate. Okay, so I think what we've seen so far is every program has its own life. Something gets passed on the Hill, there's a budget assigned to it, an agency picks it up, builds an office around it, hires people for it. You know, there's a funding notice or an RFI or something that goes out, and it gets its own momentum. And along comes another program, and now you're trying to get that first program and say, hold on a minute, you need to change the way you're doing certain things because I need you to coordinate, and it's hard to do that, right? And in the absence of an institutional capacity to coordinate, it's left to individual program managers, individual agency folks to reach out, to use their personal connections and do it, and yeah, they do it. But the broader question is, how do you create an institutional capacity whose mandate is to coordinate and is actually monitored and evaluated on how programs are coordinating, and we don't have that. And the senator talks about the fact that we don't have it on the Hill either, right? So I don't know how to solve that problem, but it is something we're seeing here, you know, that kind of seeing this on the ground.
Alan?
Thank you, everyone, for doing this panel. Doug, I was really energized to hear you talk about the software pathway. And I'm very interested to hear from all of you how you think this authority, the BA-8, could be used to a broader extent. It occurs to me that education and encouragement by leadership and from leadership is really important, because there are more programs now that don't have to worry about the color of money, whether it be RDT&E, procurement, or sustainment. Yet the pickup on this authority is relatively slow, and whereas most of our significant systems today are hardware enabled, yet software defined, that software will be very, very important. So what can we do as a community to encourage both the Hill as well as the building to make better use of that?
Yeah, I mean, Doug, you're certainly well placed, and Raj, I suspect folks want to hear from you too on this one.
So I can start. I mean, BA-8 is a subcolor of money inside R&D that was created by Congress's trial to just try to break down this barrier we have in the department. Private sector doesn't do software like this. They don't do development, procurement, and worse, sustainment with 3 different colors of money. Nobody does that. So it was an attempt at that. I think we've had some success there. I think the Hill is still waiting. The conversations I've had have been, you know, okay, we need to see some success before we grow this too much more. But here's some good news within that. I think we're finding ways where we're trying to do is if we still have to live with different colors of money, at least have it controlled by one entity. So in the Army, for example, we had in the past this somewhat artificial barrier between developing it and procuring it, and then what we called sustainment, which in the private sector would be just, you know, upgrades and keeping it working and improving it. We are now bringing that authority back under one place. Different colors of money remain, but authority over using that money is now going to all be centralized in the programs again for new software programs. So that's a half step toward what you're talking about, but I think an important one, because you know, just need the work to get done. If we can find a way to do it within existing confines, the Hill would like that. But you know, a BA-8 expansion is one of the several conversations I want to have with members and staff this year about how we're doing.
Sorry, just wait for the mic one second. Thank you.
I'd like to comment. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, I'd like to comment on the foreign talent issue. The State Department and the consular sections in our embassies abroad are a shambles when it comes to processing, H-1B visas and other visas. And we're losing a lot of world-class talent from India, from China, and from many other countries because the process is so cumbersome, so long, and then some of the people who come here have to get a security clearance after they come here to work for a DoD subcontractor. So what's happening is a lot of people that, could be the next Albert Einstein, are not showing up in the United States. And the People's Republic of China has noticed this because I'm familiar with one country, and they give people who want to study STEM and artificial intelligence in China visas in less than a month. And I just wanted to say that this is a big pipeline problem that needs to be solved and solved quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the comment I would make is, as we think about our national security innovation base in America, we should play to our strengths. And this is a competition that we are well poised to win. America's just a better place to live in than China, right? Authoritarianisms versus democracy, there's not a lot of debate out there. So this is one of our inherent strengths, and we should take advantage of it.
And I'd just add, it shouldn't be that hard politically to at least make incremental progress in this area. You're not going to solve all the immigration problems in a single bound, but we tried, if you'll remember, in NDAA a couple years ago, just to allow a handful of people with very high skills and top degrees to come in under a kind of a special exception. And nobody really disagreed with the argument. It was more a jurisdictional thing that meant we couldn't get it into the defense authorization bill. My point is, you get heads nodding when you say it's stupid for us to help educate people in PhDs in chemistry and computer science and then say you can't stay in the country. You've got to go back home. And so at least some incremental progress should be possible even with the difficulties surrounding the broader immigration debate. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Matt Waters from McKinsey. My question is for Doug Bush. I'm thinking about kind of the alignment between the labs and the programs of records and thinking about the role of RICTO and curious how kind of you see programs like that being kind of an innovative pioneer, or if those are kind of not the solution, how you would elaborate on that.
So I think the fundamental thing still remains. You've got to, whoever's doing the the R&D or the prototyping, you still have to connect to make sure there's a path to a program. So, I mean, you got to do the work. You got to do that regardless of where it is, whether it's in a more traditional government lab setting or at a prototyping activity like RICTO. So I think, and we've run into that. So, starting a prototype program has never been easier. This is a good thing. It's still difficult to just carve out the money to take those prototypes and put them into production because, again, when you get to that stage, you're now competing with everything else, fighting for those limited production dollars. So I think, again, though, leadership, what I've seen is leadership matters here. If it's important to the Army, senior leaders will make sure things do transition. And we've got a number of those underway, several big ones from RICTO, our hypersonics program, our new ground-based cruise missile program. I mean, those are templates to me, and hopefully behind them comes some directed energy work being done there. I think it's occasionally good, though, to create a new organization just when you need to just try doing things a new way, that's it's a healthy thing. So, but what you don't want over time is it to just become just like everybody else. So it's a balance, and everything needs reform. So kind of, RICTO 2.0 will probably look a little bit different, work on different things, but that's okay. You want that. Work in progress. Not a great answer, sorry.
I see Mike Brown over there.
Yeah, Mike Brown. I very much agree, Chairman Thornberry, with your comment that the most important metric on output is defense modernization. And we all know we're in a tech race with China and speed matters. I wonder if it would be helpful for us to differentiate what capabilities capabilities we're investing in that come to fruition, meaning getting fielded in warfighters' hands in the next, pick it, 2, 3, 4 years, versus the average of what it takes new capability to come in the department, which is, we've seen studies 9 to 26 years, so decades. But we rarely make that distinction. So do you agree with that, that it would be helpful to differentiate when something's coming to transition? And if so, what should we do that kind of starts to get us thinking about that and maybe encourage some balance? My perspective without an in-depth look at that is most of what we spend the R&D on is the larger programs that are coming in decades.
Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of concern about that, actually, that we're putting a lot of R&D money into things that won't pay off for a long time. And if you listen to what the Chinese leaders say, we may not have that period, certainly if we want to deter them, and we do, from aggressive sorts of action. So I do worry that there's a disconnect here. And I also worry at the thing that Doug highlighted. So you've got this innovation going here, but we don't really have a pathway to get it fielded in any scale. And so there's this gap, and that also adds to that time lag that you're talking about. So I think both of those things we really have to do better on. Last thing I'll mention is I'm persuaded Bill Greenwald, I'll have to confess, used to work on the Senate side, but he's all right anyway. But he did a study that looked at aircraft production, commercial versus aircraft production government, and the time lag on how long it took to get new airplanes in the air and so forth. And the difference ought to wake us all up. Same industry, trying to advance, big difference. We've certainly got to do better.
Doug, I'll give you your take on that.
I was hoping to duck that one. Yeah, so some things should take a while. All right, at least, not everything is rapid turn, but we've got to be able to do both and know when to, move away from something. So one challenge of anyone who's working in the department is when do you stop doing something? It's pretty hard for the department to do. It's hard for Congress to do, especially if it's a significant program and you've got investments in it and there's a workforce, et cetera. So I think the key there is the department can't be on an island. We have to work, I think, very closely with Congress, for example. If we're going to change direction on something important, to reinvest in something else, you can't just hit Congress with that, with no preamble and no, hey, I hope you're okay with this approach. You got to do it collaboratively. Have the conversations with the right members and the right staffs. And I think often we get a lot of leeway, actually, when you make your case reasonably. So number one, that's important, because doing new stuff faster, sometimes you got to stop doing something else that's just not working out. The second part is, it's been talked about a million times. There's a whole commission on it, but yeah, I mean, the cycle of this is the way we do funding, of course, inhibits that to some degree. And I think there's openness to relooking how we do that in cycle. But some of the hardest words to the Department of Defense I've heard since in my brief time there have been, this is an in-cycle change. That means in between appropriations. There's tools, they're kind of hard. So we need to continue to work with Congress, make the case that we need that kind of flexibility, and then earn the right to keep it.
There's probably time for one more question, if anybody's got, yeah.
Okay, I'll project. Divyansh Kaushik from the Federation of American Scientists. So I want to go back to one of the points that you raised, both Raj and Chairman, about the foreign talent piece. But there's another aspect to that on the research security side, where the whole announcement of the China Initiative in November 2018, and a lot of research security measures that Congress has taken. That debate continues to evolve. In fact, now probably the debate has shifted to a point where some are openly calling for whether we should even have these Chinese students in the U.S. in the first place. Would you have what are your thoughts on that? If you would elaborate.
Sure. And I think, as I go back to even think about talent, the one thing I'd say, sometimes you go to these meetings here in DC on the challenges, and everything is so gloom and doom. I feel like both my time in government and now in the Valley, like the best days are when you go out and meet young folks doing the work, right? Young folks in uniform or entrepreneurs, like that's very, very motivating. But to your point, look, there's always a challenge from a counterintelligence standpoint, because our foreign adversaries will use these mechanisms to inject compromised situations. But that's a known science. Like, we know how to do counterintel. We have whole agencies that know how to do that. So I think there can be an appropriate balance between adequate counterintelligence to protect our secrets, yet being an opening, welcoming place. And again, I'd go back to, that this is a great place to come. And so you're going to bring families, and people are going to stay here for long periods of time. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic than a short-term exchange.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a good place to end. We're at time. Thank you so much to our panelists. Yeah.